Hey guys, I'm Caleb, and I've got a question for you. Have you ever forgotten something? Maybe it was your best friend's birthday, or your parents' big anniversary, or a homework assignment. We've all been there, right? I mean, I know I have. Ooh, let me tell you guys about a time I forgot one little thing and paid a hot price. You'll see what I mean in a second. So when I was in middle school, I was an incredible baker. Like Top Chef Junior level incredible. Problem was, they wouldn't invite you on the show if you only knew how to make brownies, but we don't have to talk about that. Anyway, I came home from school one day and my mom asked me to make brownies because we were having company over later. She also asked my brothers and I to completely clean our rooms because, you know, guests might want to eat on your bed for dinner. Not, just messing, I love you, Mom. Anyway, I proceeded to do what any middle schooler with a list of chores and homework to complete would naturally do: take a nap without setting an alarm. Guys, your boy woke up with 25 minutes before company arrived. So I sprinted downstairs, I started the brownies, and then I ran around the house trying to complete all my chores. Well, our friend showed up right as the oven rang that the brownies were done. So I sprinted over to the oven, I pulled the pan out of the oven, and soon I realized I made a critical error. Halfway up to the counter, my hands felt icy cold, which, if you don't know, is the sensation you feel when your hands are being seared by a glass pan that is being held without oven mitts. I threw the pan onto the counter and I screamed, "Ah!" But it was more like, "Ah! Ah!" Yeah, it wasn't a great night for me. And I did get out of finishing homework though, so that was a win. But ultimately, forgetting something like I did isn't that big of a deal. It all ended up fine, right? And I got a funny story out of it. But forgetting other things, bigger things, well, that can have bigger consequences. If we forget our best friend's birthday, their feelings get hurt. If we forget to turn in a major assignment or study for a big test, our grades take a big hit. If we forget to do our chores, we get grounded. No matter what it is, we all have a tendency to forget. It's one thing that we all have in common. That's why we use objects to help us remember the significant and meaningful things, events, and people in our lives. Take this stuffed animal, for example. For most people, it's just a normal, everyday stuffed animal. I forgot how soft this was. There's nothing special about it, right? But for me, it reminds me of my little brother. Aw, I know, it's so cute, whatever. Anyway, he used to have a huge stuffed animal collection at the end of his bed. I'm not even kidding you. It was probably about 50 stuffed animals. And he had them at the end of his bed for an amount of time that I'm not gonna say, because I love him. Love you, Samuel. This object right here is meaningful to me because it helps me remember him. You see, I'm gonna set this guy right here. You see, we all use reminders so that we don't forget things that are important to us. We use reminders in our notebooks, or alerts on our phones, or even lists in our planners to remind us of the things we need to remember. It's why we hold on to things that remind us of important people or big experiences in our lives. We take pictures and collect shells and record videos on vacation so we can remember the fun we had on that trip. We give out trophies to winning teams so that they can display them to remember their victory. We hold on to things that belong to loved ones who have passed away because it reminds us of them. We do it because we know how easy it is to forget. Hold on, I love Bob, but he's gotta go. But say bye, bye, buddy. Okay, so back to what I was saying. The same thing is true when it comes to our faith. And I think if we're being honest, we'd all say that we sometimes forget about Jesus too. And you're probably thinking, I never forget about Jesus. But think about it. When things are going well in our lives, it's so easy to forget how much we need Jesus. Sometimes we move through our days without thinking about him at all. And when life feels hard or frustrating, we do the same thing. In those seasons, it's easy to forget the ways we've seen God work in our lives in the past. We forget about what he's done before and only see the struggle that's right in front of us. Now you might be sitting there thinking, Why is that such a big deal, man? I mean, come on, if God is always with us, why does it matter if we don't remember him? Well, think back to what we said earlier. We want to remember things that are important to us. And if Jesus is one of those important parts of our lives, we want to remember him. We want to make sure that things like his love and his faithfulness and his compassion and his sacrifice for us are things that we hold on to in our minds. Okay, over the next few weeks, we're going to look at different conversations Jesus had with his followers during his last days on earth. You see, Jesus knew his time left on earth was limited, and he wanted to make the most of every moment. That's why Jesus saved some of his best wisdom for his last days with his followers. And the good news for us is that many of those followers wrote Jesus' word down so that we can remember and learn from them today. While Jesus was on earth, he had a close group of friends, the disciples, that he spent most of his time with. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I think there's Timothy, James. There was 12, and that's not 12. They learned from him, they traveled with him, and they loved him. And one of those guys, Luke, I got that name, wrote about one of his last encounters with Jesus in a book of the Bible named, take a guess? Yep, Luke. They super creative chapter names in the whatever. In Luke 22, Jesus used something familiar to remind his disciples of something really important. As the story opens, the disciples were getting ready to celebrate Passover. Back then, Passover was a celebratory meal that helped the Jewish people remember something God had done for them long ago. Hundreds of years before this meal the disciples were going to have with Jesus, God did something really cool. He rescued his people, the Israelites, out of slavery. When that happened, the Israelites started celebrating Passover to remember the way God had protected them and set them free. And it was such a big deal that even thousands of years later, the Jewish people today still celebrate the Passover meal to remember the event. And it was at this Passover meal with his disciples that Jesus chose to give some of his final instructions. We're going to take a look at Luke 22, verse 14. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. That is huge. Jesus was excited to spend this last celebration with his disciples. He was eager to share one of his last moments with his closest friends because he knew what was ahead, and he knew he was about to suffer and die on the cross. He knew he was about to leave his disciples overwhelmed with fear and sadness, and because of that, he wanted to make sure they would remember all the things he taught them. So here's what he did. After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. So what was so important that Jesus used one of his last moments with his disciples to say it? Remembrance. Jesus told his disciples to remember. He knew that tough times were ahead, and those tough times would make it hard for the disciples to remember all the great things Jesus had taught them. It would make it hard to remember the things he did and the way he loved them. That's why in one of his last moments, Jesus told them to remember. Remember that I am for you. And remember, I'm coming back. And guess what? He's saying the same thing to us. So why is it so important for us to remember Jesus and what he's done for us? Because when we forget, we can start to feel anxious, afraid, and alone. We might even be tempted to think that Jesus isn't with us or for us at all. When life isn't going the way we hoped, it's important to remember what Jesus did so that we know he's still with us and for us. In other words, we remember what Jesus has done to know he is still working. And what's cool about this story from Luke is that Jesus actually gave us a great way to remember him. While the Israelites used Passover to remember what God had done, we have communion. That's what Jesus was demonstrating when he broke bread with his disciples that day. And when we participate in communion, we are remembering together what Jesus has done and is doing in our lives. With his disciples, Jesus used bread and wine during communion. He didn't do that because they were delicious or just what happened to be on the table. He chose them because they were common, everyday parts of the culture back then. Jesus knew that his disciples would encounter bread and wine often in their days. And when they did, he wanted them to remember him. They were no longer just things to eat and drink. No, now they would be symbols of remembrance. It's a lot like that bear that helps me remember my little brother. Okay, here's the deal. We remember what Jesus has done to know he is still working. Think of it like this. When you remember the championship game you won or maybe lost last year, it makes it easier to push through the pain of practices. When you remember the good times you had with a friend that moved away, it makes it easier to look forward to seeing them again. And when life gets hard, or you feel discouraged, or you just aren't sure what the plan is for the rest of your life, you can remember what Jesus has done for you in the past to remind you that he is still working for you in the present. So what would look different about our lives if we made a point to remember what Jesus has done for us? Well, I think it would change the way we see our circumstances, good or bad. It would help us see God working in the good things and give us hope that he is still working in the tough things. And here's how you can start. First, make a list. Make a list of all the things you have seen God do in your life or the lives of others close to you. It can be things that you're thankful for, good things you've experienced, or relationships that mean a ton to you. Maybe you've seen God provide for you, your family, or a friend in a huge way. Even if you're not sure, write it down. Let this list encourage you and give you hope that Jesus is still working. Second, choose a reminder. In the same way Jesus chose bread and wine as reminders for his disciples, choose something to be a reminder of what Jesus is doing in your life. Maybe it's an everyday object or a daily habit you have. For me, it's Starbucks. Whenever I get that hot tea, I take a minute to remember what Jesus has done and is doing. It's a simple, routine way to remember the not so simple work Jesus is doing in my life. So today, remember this. We remember what Jesus has done to know he is still working. As you head out today, I want you to think about this question. What is one thing that makes remembering what Jesus has done for me difficult to do?